Tactical is a bad term in a way because tactical is not really a weapon. It's not about the weapon. It's about the kind of use. And you can use both short-range weapons, low yield, high yield, intercontinental range, any nuclear weapon in a tactical way. It doesn't require a particularly small weapon to do that.
That's the voice of Hans Kristensen, director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plasters Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hi, Tom. Great to see you. How was your weekend?
Lauren, great to see you too, as always. It was a very nice weekend, very quiet, went for a hike, went for a bike ride, admired the changing leaves. Very relaxing. How was yours?
Mine was the same, except without the hiking. I just drove around because, as we were talking about earlier, before we started recording this podcast, I'm not a hiker like you, Tom, but maybe one day I will be. But what do you have for us this week on the nuclear front?
There's always hope for the future. On nuclear news, this week NATO is starting a 2-week military exercise to plan for, wait for it, nuclear war. It's known as Steadfast Noon. The exercise is centered at the Klein-Brogel Air Base in Belgium. This is one of 6 air bases in Europe where the U.S. stores B-61 nuclear bombs. The United States bases about 100 non-strategic or battlefield nuclear weapons in Europe. These are often mistakenly called tactical nuclear weapons, but more on that later in the show. And U.S. strategic B-52 bombers will also participate in the NATO exercise. These exercises are held every year, so they're routine. But this is not a normal year. Given the war in Ukraine and Russia's nuclear threats, there is a danger that Russia could misinterpret these exercises for the real thing, just as Russia did in 1983 during the Able Archer exercise, so NATO must be careful. And Russia is expected to hold its own nuclear exercises before the end of the month. The next 2 weeks also mark the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as we highlighted on the show last week. The fact that we are facing nuclear catastrophe yet again shows that the world failed to learn the fundamental lessons from Cuba, which are that as long as nuclear weapons exist, the risk of nuclear war will be a constant danger, and that luck was the most important factor in avoiding nuclear war. But of course, we cannot always be lucky. In Washington, the Biden administration released its long-awaited national security strategy last week. Biden's goal when he entered office was originally to have the strategy focus on China, but the release of the strategy was delayed once Russia invaded Ukraine, so that the strategy could focus on Russia as well as China. We will bring you more analysis on this later in the show, so stay tuned. In China, the Communist Party kicked off its national leadership meeting in Beijing on Sunday. Xi Jinping is expected to stay on for a 3rd term as leader, a position that has historically only been kept for 2 5-year terms. There was no direct mention of the war in Ukraine, but Xi did emphasize China's position on Taiwan, saying it will, quote, strive for peaceful reunification, unquote, but, quote, never promise to renounce the use of force, unquote. Lauren, what do you have up next for us on Early Warning?
This week for Early Warning, I sat down with Allen Hester, who leads the Friends Committee on National Legislation's Nuclear Disarmament and Pentagon Spending Portfolio. We bring you analysis on the Biden-Harris National Security Strategy, which you mentioned a few minutes ago, Tom, that was released last week. So we discuss what it entails and what it means for the long-awaited nuclear posture review.
And then I sit down with Hans Kristensen, the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. There's a lot of information out there about so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Hans has the facts to sort it all out, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning, Early Warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. The Biden-Harris administration finally released its long-awaited national security strategy last week on October 12th. The document, which every new administration is required to issue and which identifies the key national security threats and the administration's plans to address them, was delayed last winter as it became clear that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was imminent. According to this report, the most significant challenge for the United States in the coming years will be outcompeting China and restraining Russia while restoring a damaged democracy at home. The 48-page national security strategy outlined China's moves toward authoritarian governance and revisionist foreign policy as a primary concern. Now that the national security strategy has been released, one of the many questions now circulating is on the timing of the Biden-Harris Nuclear Posture Review, otherwise known as the NPR. Today, we're joined by Allen Hester, who leads the Friends Committee on National Legislation's Nuclear Disarmament and Pentagon Spending Portfolio. It's great to have you here today, Allen.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So before we discuss the NPR, a few questions on the national security strategy. Could you tell our listeners what you think its three biggest takeaways are?
I'll divide up the takeaways into two kind of camps, the good and maybe the unsurprising. So the good is that, the administration's putting a real focus on climate change as a security threat, labeling it one of the most daunting challenges of our time. It includes pledges, I think, to invest in preventing pandemics, reducing global inequality, addressing the divisions that are threatening the future of American democracy, helping foster economic developments in countries that are struggling to meet people's needs. And then on the nuclear front specifically, there's real commitments to arms control, which reference the importance of follow-up agreements to the New START treaty, et cetera. And I think all of that speaks to a redefined vision of security that reflects a much broader range of potential threats and issues. And while all of that is really important and great, and it's good that they've included them, it's important to acknowledge that these are being added on alongside the same traditional militarized security issues, which I think on that front is a much more blatant continuation of the status quo. So moving to the unsurprising piece. On the traditional security level, it reads like a continuation of strategy. Great power competition is one of the guiding principles of U.S. engagement for the rest of the world, which justifies the need to have the strongest military in the world. Much of that rhetoric is attached to the importance of a global rules-based order. There's a line in the document that essentially says, never before has the U.S. encountered two nuclear near-peer competitors, referencing China and Russia. And you combine all of that with the administration's validation that inflation is going to impact the national security space. I think this document really sets up Congress and the administration to spend a lot more money on anything that can be labeled essential to security. And I think it will encourage policymakers to reattach the U.S. to a more militarized spending, more nuclear weapons modernization. And that's purely because of the size of the military ambition that is outlined in this document. I think what will be interesting is if these other new pieces of security are prioritized and funded to the same degree that the traditional security capabilities are prioritized.
Thank you so much for all the information. That was great. Pivoting a little bit, according to this new strategy, China is America's, quote, most consequential geopolitical challenge. So given the ongoing war in Ukraine and Putin's nuclear threats, was this what we expected?
I think it's totally fair for listeners to hear that and be surprised given the invasion of Ukraine. It is less surprising, I think, to those of us who were lobbying and talking with members of Congress before the invasion. China was the only thing that members of Congress were talking about before the invasion of Ukraine occurred. In fact, when we kept hearing that the national security strategy was being delayed, one of the primary justifications that we kept hearing for why there was a delay was that the document was very China-focused, and the administration had to rework it to more intentionally include Russia after the invasion. I think it's totally fair to say that how the U.S. defines its relationship with China in the coming decades will be one of the most consequential foreign policy decisions of our lifetime. As bad as things are with our relationship with Russia at the moment, we have existing models of how to work together. We have arms control, New START verification, crisis communication. All of this points to a system that has continued to define the Russia-U.S. relationship for decades. We still have to set some of those guidelines up and the rules of the road as it relates to our relationship with China. So I think it's important for us to remember that despite the invasion of Ukraine sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, the recent Speaker Pelosi trip to Taiwan cut through the media coverage on Ukraine. And I think that speaks to the potential for sudden escalation in the context of the U.S.-China relationship.
That makes sense and is oddly comforting. So hopefully we can get those communication channels set up. to avoid any kind of nuclear use with China in the future. So thank you. Finally, does the release of this strategy indicate that we should expect to see the nuclear posture review soon? And do you think it will be similar to this national security strategy?
I think we should expect to see the nuclear posture review soon. I think we can expect its release soon. We always were told that it would be paired with the release of the national security strategy, but there would be a delay. So I would imagine in the next couple of weeks, we should see the nuclear posture review, and I expect it to be pretty similar in terms of rhetoric to the national security strategy. On the one hand, I think I expect it to put a lot of emphasis on the role of arms control as a key tool of national security. I expect it to be more intentional in saying that the US takes arms control seriously and has a desire to improve and build upon the existing arms control regime, especially if you compare it to President Trump's nuclear posture review. On the other hand, I think it will continue to frame US nuclear weapons as a key part of US national security. And it will say that despite the president's desire to reduce the role of nuclear weapons in national security, that the current security environment makes it really hard to achieve that goal. And therefore, I do expect a greater emphasis on risk reduction measures to respond to the current moment. I do think that the most notable change will likely be the president's emphasis on integrated deterrence. And how do we maintain deterrence in a way that doesn't solely rely on nuclear weapons? But nukes will remain, I think, the backbone, so to speak, of national security in the rhetoric. My hope with this document is that on top of laying out the current threats, the administration needs to lay out how they plan to move forward and make the security environment more conducive to arms control. So in other words, if a no first use policy, for example, isn't possible today, what would have to change in the security environment for the president to consider that policy change? Or if the US wants to get back to normal strategic stability talks with Russia, what conditions would be required for that to occur? The NPR, if nothing else, needs to offer a clear path forward out of the current moment we're in.
Well, you and I share that hope, Allen. Unfortunately, our time is up, so thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Russian President Putin is escalating nuclear tensions to a level we have not seen for over 50 years. Fears are rising about the risks of nuclear war. Most recently, Putin said he would use nuclear weapons to defend the illegally annexed regions in Ukraine. This prompted President Biden to warn Putin that once a nuclear weapon is used, quote, the mistakes get made, and the miscalculation could occur. No one can be sure what would happen and could end in Armageddon, unquote. So what might a Russian nuclear attack in Ukraine look like? There is much talk about so-called tactical nuclear weapons. Some even describe them as small. But are any nuclear weapons really tactical or small? Are these terms helpful to understanding the current situation, or are they serving to minimize the dangers we face? To help us understand all this, today we are joined by Hans Kristensen, Director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. Hans, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me.
So, when the media refers to tactical nuclear weapons, what are they referring to? In nuclear strategy, what does tactical even mean? For example, former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis once said, I don't think there is any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any nuclear weapon used at any time is a strategic game changer. So is he right?
Yeah, he's definitely right. Tactical is a bad term in a way because tactical is not really a weapon. It's not about the weapon. It's about the kind of use. And you can use both short-range weapons, low yield, high yield, intercontinental range, any nuclear weapon in a tactical way. It doesn't require a particularly small weapon to do that. Some also call them non-strategic, which is slightly better in the sense that it connotes that these are shorter range weapons. They don't have an intercontinental range. But that's sort of where the good comparisons stop, because it's like, in tactical nuclear weapons, the ones we see today, or I should stop calling them tactical and calling them non-strategic, they exist in a wide range of yields and for very many different purposes. And sort of typically the yields exist from around 1 kiloton and all the way up to several hundred kiloton. So in comparison, the Hiroshima bomb, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima back in 1945, had a yield of 15 kiloton. That is, by today's standards, considered a tactical nuclear weapon or a non-strategic nuclear weapon, a low-yield nuclear weapon. But like I said, they can go down to 1 kiloton or even less than 1 kiloton, depending on what the use is. My sense is, though, that overwhelmingly nuclear weapons, even these short-range weapons, have higher yields. They have yields that are in the sort of tens of kilotons up to maybe 100, maybe 200, depending on the mission. It's important to remind people here that the yield is not determined by the type of weapon. The yield is determined by what kind of target it's intended to be used against. Some require bigger yields than others. So there's a lot of confusion about these terms.
And just one example is this, as you said, the referring to things as non-strategic, tactical, or even battlefield nuclear weapons seems to have more to do with the range of the weapon than the yield of the weapon. And yet there's this perception out there that somehow non-strategic nuclear weapons are small. We're seeing articles about this in the media. What is your sense of what's going on here? Are they really small?
Well, as usual with size, it depends on what you compare it with. Small in the nuclear sense is much larger than even the biggest conventional weapon you have in the arsenals today. In the US arsenal, for example, the lowest yield we believe is built into a nuclear weapon is equivalent to 300 tons of TNT explosive going off at the same time. That is a massive explosion compared to even the largest conventional bomb that the United States has built, and even the Russians. So there's no comparison with conventional weapons. And unlike conventional weapons, what you also have from nuclear weapons is, radiation, both prompt radiation that comes from the explosion itself, but also residual radiation that will linger in the environment, depending on how you explode this weapon, how dirty the explosion is. So there are unique things about nuclear weapons that you cannot compare to conventional.
So is it fair to say that these suggestions, perceptions that non-strategic nuclear weapons are small are incorrect, right? Because yes, they could be smaller than some, but they could also be large, right? There's a whole range of yields that non-strategic nuclear weapons could result in.
Yeah, generalizations like these are generally unhelpful. And the dangerous part of it, of course, when people start talking about low yield or small nukes or mini nukes or whatever names people give it, then you begin to sort of get this creeping assumption that it's not dangerous, that it's sort of not as bad as the bigger ones. And of course, in terms of pure blast effect, yes, you can argue that a very small nuclear weapon is not as destructive as a very large nuclear weapon. Of course, those are the physics. But the nasty little thing here with nuclear weapons, no matter what their yield is, once you start to use them, then you enter this dangerous, murky, unpredictable environment in which large nuclear weapon states are unlikely to back down. They're unlikely to back. They're more likely to answer the use with their own use of nuclear weapons. That depends, of course, on what kind of situation we're in and what nuclear weapon state we're talking about, because countries have very different non-nuclear means. Some would have to respond sooner, some can wait longer and still have massive conventional capabilities to respond to a very limited attack. But once you get into this nuclear territory, all bets are in principle off.
As George Shultz once said, a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon. You start with a smaller one, you go to a larger one. Don't go there. So let's get into more specifics about what actually might happen in a nuclear attack in Ukraine. Putin recently launched over 80 missiles at cities and critical infrastructure in Ukraine. The missiles used were, for example, the Kh-101 air-launched cruise missile, the Caliber sea-launched cruise missile, the Iskander-M short-range ballistic missile. These were all used with conventional warheads, but they're nuclear capable. Do these attacks give you any insight into what weapons Putin might use in a possible theoretical nuclear attack?
Not directly, I would say. The point is that he has used a wide range of weapons that can do this, but many of the weapons you talked about are dual capable, or there are versions that exist of them. They're very similar that can deliver a nuclear warhead. The Iskander ballistic missile, of course, is one that is deployed. It's in the field. It's been used in the war in Ukraine in the conventional version, but it can also fire a nuclear warhead. And so some people in the intelligence community believe that if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon in this conflict, tactical nuclear weapon, or as we like to say, non-strategic nuclear weapon, it would most likely be a weapon like the Iskander. And the reason is that it's probably the most reliable, harder to shoot down than the cruise missiles, much more reliable than sending a tactical fighter aircraft in to drop a bomb. And so that sort of points to this. And that is, of course, the big if, if Putin were to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. We're fortunately not there yet. And it seems unlikely, but it is an important discussion to have nonetheless.
And if it were the Iskander that were used, please tell our guests what the likely yield of that warhead would be.
Well, so it's thought that it has a yield that's from 10 or just below 10 kiloton and up to something in the order of 50, maybe a couple of more tens of kiloton. There's no international data. There's no official data on this. So we can assume if you have a ballistic missile and you want to use it against these kinds of targets, including underground command bunkers or depots or big airfields or something like that, what kind of yield would you need to be able to do that? And that's generally speaking how people come up with these assessments. But there's no official data on it. But it would definitely, most likely, be sort of in the order of a Hiroshima-Nagasaki bomb explosion. Nothing small about that. But of course, it all depends where this conflict is going.
Biden said in a recent interview, quote, that the mistakes can be made, the miscalculations, who knows what could happen. What was he talking about? What is your sense of the risks of mistakes and miscalculation in the current situation?
Yeah, the miscalculation part is the biggest thing, I think. Whenever we have these crises happening, and certainly in wars, there's a sort of an expression called the fog of war, where countries get sort of immersed in this thing that is beginning to happen quickly, and they have to respond to this and that. And in those events can happen misunderstandings. You can misread what's happening. You can misunderstand what's going on in the field. You can misinterpret what an adversary is saying or trying to do and take steps that are more escalatory that could get things going, more than it did before. And then, of course, you can also have incidents where someone by mistake launches something that shouldn't be launched at that point. So all sorts of things can go wrong. And that is another complicating factor. And of course, it's one of the most unpleasant factors because it's the big uncertainty. You cannot be certain how, once you start getting these intense wars, how the battle is going to unfold. And so mistakes almost certainly will happen.
It's almost like President Biden was remembering his lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, of which we're at the 60th anniversary, right? Where one of the major lessons of that crisis is that we had mistakes, we had misperceptions and miscalculations, and we were just lucky that nuclear weapons were not used.
Yeah, and it's funny, we like to use nuclear crises as examples of this problem, of reading things correctly. But just think about all sorts of assessments of international security issues, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's, all other areas where the intelligence community has to look at the data that's available and make decisions or make determinations. They very often get things wrong. So That just gets a lot more dicey if you have nuclear forces pointing at each other. Mistakes can be made.
Right. You make a mistake with a conventional weapon, it's bad, but it may not be the end of the world. You make a mistake with a nuclear weapon, it's a lot worse.
With the conventional, you might live to talk about it, but if you have an escalation that gets out of control with nuclear, then we're talking about serious stuff. And of course, the big concern here, and when Biden talks about Armageddon, is exactly that idea that once it starts running, it can be hard to predict where it's going to go. And we could be talking about very significant destruction, even from a limited engagement with nuclear forces. This is something that neither side has any interest in getting into.
Nor do we have much experience either. So speaking of miscalculations and misperceptions, NATO is planning to conduct a nuclear weapons exercise, Steadfast Noon, which is an annual exercise, admittedly. And the NATO Secretary General has said that the allies have no plans to cancel or delay the exercise. In your view, is this a good idea, or is this just the kind of thing that could lead to a miscalculation?
I think it's a problematic idea to move forward with this one right now. Over the last week or two, we've seen a significant escalation of the rhetoric on both sides. And you can always have this exercise. It doesn't have to happen now. And NATO is not hurt. Its capability is not hurt if it doesn't have it exactly now. But here we are, and now we're in a situation where almost you can't delay it, because if you delay it, you seem to be weak. You have to stand up to Putin. Even though this exercise is not an exercise that has come about as a response to what Putin is doing in Ukraine or anything else. It's an annual exercise, happens every year. So it's sort of routine nuclear exercising, but it nonetheless signals. And there's no doubt in my mind that once it happens next week, it's going to make its way right into the rhetoric on the Russian side. This is an example of NATO doing irresponsible things, and we have for many years said we should get rid of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, and look at it going the other way. So, there's no doubt it's going to find its way in there. But it's not the only incident there, or the only case of such a routine exercise. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had another incident where on the very same day that Putin announced the annexation, his intention to annex these 4 new regions in Ukraine, and explicitly threatened use of nuclear weapons if Russian territorial integrity, hint, those new annexations in Ukraine was violated. On that very same day, the US Air Force held a large bomber exercise up at Minot Air Force Base, in which they exercised loading of nuclear cruise missiles, rapid takeoff of bombers, and at the same time, 4 of those bombers from that base were in Europe. And hours after Putin gave his speech, they took off from their base in England, and 2 of them flew up over Sweden and operated in an area in northern Sweden where they sort of hung out for a couple of hours, 600 kilometers from the Russian strategic base on the Kola Peninsula. It was not linked directly to this, nor is the tactical weapons exercise next week directly linked to this base. But activities, they signal and they play into the perception of what the threat is. Remember back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when somebody comes in and tells Kennedy that the military has tested a nuclear weapon out in the Pacific. It wasn't linked to that particular crisis. It was just sort of a routine nuclear thing you do. He acted very forcefully to that because of the danger that it can add to a misperception on the other side of what the signaling is at the time.
So all of this, to me, gets to the dangerous game that deterrence really is, right? Because all we can do at this point is try to persuade Putin not to use nuclear weapons. There's nothing we can actually do to prevent it. We're deterring Putin. We're persuading Putin not to do it. NATO would argue that these exercises are an important part of that persuasion, right? Because NATO needs to persuade Putin that they're credible, that they're capable, that they could respond. And so you're left, as you said, with this situation where you could, on the one hand, look strong or look weak and you're in this game, but you really don't have any idea how the other side, in this case, President Putin, is perceiving what you're doing.
Yes. One thing that worried me, of course, to some extent, was that when NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg held his intro prepared statement, by the way, for this NATO defense ministers meeting that's now underway in Brussels, right there in the statement, included into the very section of the statement that talks about Russia's outrageous war in Ukraine and NATO's response to it, right in there, they put a paragraph in about this exercise. I would imagine that any speechwriter would not do that, because you could sort of get the wrong impression sent to Moscow that now NATO is signaling something new with tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. I don't think they intended to do that explicitly, but this is how things play out. This is a real dilemma. We might also see a Russian nuclear exercise. There is a missile launch that is being announced, sort of a warning of a forthcoming missile launch in the Arctic waters, an area where they typically test from. And there's some speculation that the Russians might conduct this annual GROM strategic force exercise. We don't know if they will, we'll see. But these routine activities, so to speak, happen on both sides. And when they happen together with significantly increasing rhetoric about the importance of nuclear weapons, then it's a cause of concern, of course.
So Hans, last question for you. If we're lucky enough to get through this current crisis, what lessons should we be learning to prevent the next one?
Well, the first one, of course, is that there is an enormous job to be done to kind of restore the principle internationally that you do not use military might to move borders. You don't attack countries, period. And that's a tough one, because all countries that have large militaries, they sort of reserve the right to use them against other countries if they see fit. And everybody has their national security interests and their principles, and they all believe they're right and what have you. In this case, what's unique about it, of course, it is happening in Central Europe, and we're talking about a destruction that is, we haven't seen anything like this since World War II. So this also raises this issue here that even if Putin used a couple of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, the damage would most likely not be anything near what he has caused already with conventional weapons. Tens of thousands of people have died. Cities and villages have been devastated. I mean, short of annihilating Kyiv, with millions of people and things like that, you could be excused to think it was more of the same. But of course, it would be a nuclear step that would bring escalation to another level.
Hans, thanks so much. I want to thank you for your time and wish you all the best in all your work.
Hope to see you again.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.